Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. And we are continuing our series through the book of Acts, putting the kingdom on the map. We're looking at the first 12 chapters from the book of Acts, and we are coming close to the end of our series through these 12 chapters. This is lesson 9 of 10. We're going to be talking about God's plan from the beginning, looking at Acts 9:32 through 11:18. So there are a lot of verses in here. If you want to see all the verses kind of read out loud, I have videos on those loaded up to YouTube of just the text we'll be going over. But this series, there will be 3 videos in this lesson, and we're going to be looking at some of the points of what happens as Luke tells the story of the Christian church first engaging on a categorical level Gentiles. Up to this point, the predominant people within the Christian church were Jewish followers of Jesus, but at this moment, in especially 10 and 11, that changes and the gospel engages the Gentiles for the first time. Now, there are a couple places where Gentiles are mentioned as being believers, and there's the story we looked at in chapter 8 where Philip engages the Ethiopian eunuch who would be a Gentile, but this is the moment where it goes from being predominantly, the church predominantly reaching Jewish people of Jewish descent with the gospel, to the place where they open up an entire new ministry into intentionally reaching Gentiles with the gospel. So in order to understand that, we're going to spend this video, the first video, talking about Jews and Gentiles. What does it mean? What do those words mean? How do those words connect to each other? And why was it such a big deal for the Christian church to be predominantly Jewish at the very beginning and then transition into having a ministry among Gentiles? Why was this an issue? And the idea between Jews and Gentiles, and this is one of the main points I want us to get out of this lesson, the first lesson this week, a clear and robust definition of who we are as God's people is helpful when including others. In order to include others, we need to have a sense of who we are so that we know how to include others. Who are the Jews? So, in order to understand what it means for the gospel to go to the Gentiles, we need to understand how the Jews thought about Gentiles and why they thought this way. And in order for us to understand how the Jews thought about the Gentiles, we also need to understand how the Jews defined themselves. The easiest and maybe the most accurate definition of a Gentile is simply anyone who is not a Jew. Now, just to preface this, I am mostly going to be talking about ancient Judaism, nation of Israel throughout the Old Testament period, the intertestamental times, and at the time of Jesus. This has very little to do with the Jewish folks in and around our world today. It's history to them, but I'm going to be stopping at the time of Acts in the first century with this detail. So who are the Jews? It's who did the Jews think themselves to be at the time of the writing of the book of Acts? And how did that identity, that Jewish identity at the time of the book of Acts come about? Those are the questions that we'll be dealing with today. So the Jews saw themselves as a people specifically created by God. In the first century, the Jewish nation and people of the nation of Israel, Jewish people, saw themselves as a people that Yahweh, that God, went out of his way and took some very clear actions to create. Those clear actions are the Old Testament story. They were oppressed foreigners in Egypt when they cried out God heard them, remembered the covenant with their ancestors, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and delivered them through what is known as the Exodus. Then God established a covenant with them through giving them the law. The law was provided to Jewish people so that God can maintain a presence in and among them. Then God takes this newly created people and gives them a home, the promised land. So it's this Exodus, it's the law, it's the promised land. Those are the three rather central identity creating pieces of what it meant to be Jewish. They were a delivered people created out of this deliverance in Egypt. They were a Torah or law-based people centered around the law that was given to them. And they were a people who were given a land by God, the promised land. Now, every part of what it meant to be Jewish, the covenant with the ancestors, the Exodus, the law, and the promised land, was provided for them by direct action of God. God chose to create them. God chose to set them apart. And then later, the Davidic monarchy and the Jerusalem temple became symbols of this special relationship. So it was this idea that God set the Jewish nation apart. God pulled them out of Egypt. God pulled the ancestors out of that, created a covenant with them, pulled them out of Egypt, gave them the law, gave them the promised land. And in the midst of doing that, the temple is being created and the Davidic monarchy is being created. God created the Jewish people to be the Jewish people, and they were being faithful to God by being who God created them to be. Now, becoming Jewish, how would somebody who was not ethnically Jewish become Jewish? And this was kind of outlined in the Old Testament scriptures, and we can see this. And it was going through the same process that the Jewish folks went through to become Jewish themselves. So we can see if the Jewish people cried out to God, God heard them. God remembered the covenant with the ancestors, delivered them through the Exodus, gave them the law, and established them in the promised land. So there are verses that talk about if they, the foreigner, the outsider, the exile, the immigrant, cry out to God, God will hear them. They can be included in the covenant through circumcision. So if the foreigner wants to be included in the nation of Israel, in the people of God, in the Jewish community, they have to go through the same process of engaging in circumcision. They can be included in the Exodus through the Passover, even though they weren't there, even though they weren't part of the Jewish nation when the Exodus happened, although current Jews that at the time of the first century weren't either, but they were all included in the Passover, in the Exodus by participating in the Passover. Passover included them in the Exodus. They can be included in the law through hearing and obeying it. And then there was this future hope in Ezekiel of being established in the land like the Jewish nation was established in the land. So the Jews were created by God through this process of the covenant with the ancestors, the Exodus, the law, and the promised land. So foreigners could go through a proselytizing sort of experience in the same way. They could be included in the covenant with the ancestors through the process of circumcision. They could be included in the Exodus through participating in the Passover. They could be included in the covenant law by hearing and obeying it. They may have in Ezekiel hints at this idea that they might even be included in the giving of the land. That was never actually officially practiced because of what happens at the exile, what happens when Israel loses the land. So, and becoming Jewish, certain nations were required to wait for 3 generations in order to be fully incorporated into the people of God. 3 generations meant that the father converted to Judaism through circumcision. That father would almost always immediately circumcise his son, which was more of a parental decision than the the son's decision. And then if the son chose to circumcise the grandson, if it passed on to another generation, then the family would be considered fully Jewish. Now, there were other nations that were stipulated that they had to wait for 10 generations. This may have been a euphemism for never. So certain nations may have never been able to become Jewish, but most of the nations listed in there, they could become Jewish and included in the people of God, included in the nation of Israel after 3 generations practiced the act of circumcision, the father, the son, and the grandson. But then the exile changes this. The fundamental relationship between Jew and Gentile changes in the exile because of what the exile did for these identity markers of what it means to be Jewish. With the Promised Land, the Temple, the Davidic monarchy, the Jewish identity was stable and the boundary between Jew and Gentile was established. They could ponder the question of how should we allow a willing Gentile to be added to the group? How can we include others? During the exile, those identity-establishing boundaries and symbols were removed. The Promised Land was taken from the temple was destroyed, the Davidic monarchy was ended. So the Jewish identity became less stable. It also became absolutely vital and simultaneously more difficult to maintain a distinct Jewish identity from the surrounding cultures. To maintain their identity, the boundary between Jew and Gentile became more rigid and less permeable. How can we survive as a people became a much harder question to answer. So how can we include others became less important and less of a focus and less of a thing to consider. How do we survive became more important than how do we include. So for 500 years, at the time of the writing of the book of Acts, for 500 years since the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, Jewish identity as distinct people had to be actively maintained. Now, many of the other ethnic groups conquered, displaced, and exiled by successive empires of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and finally Romans were just absorbed into the majority culture and ceased to exist. The rigid line drawn between Jew and Gentile is what allowed the Jewish identity to persist, but it also greatly limited how much intimate contact and impact the Jews could have on the culture around them. So there was a way to convert to Judaism to become part of the people of God, but how important that was, how that was changed, how inclusive the Jewish people became was different when they had a well-established identity in their own land with their own king, with their own temple, than it was when they were in exile. And even when they came back from exile, they still didn't have all those identity-creating markers. They were still sort of a people oppressed, a people ruled by an outside force. So the idea of them adding somebody to the fold became much more rigid and much less permeable. So, and this is the question that we're going to be engaging in this chapter, and actually Acts engages all the way up through chapter 15. Did Gentiles need to become Jewish, become proselytes, go through circumcision and all those sorts of pieces, and join God's chosen people in order to faithfully follow Jesus? That's the question we're going to be pondering. Did you have to become Jewish to be Christian? Or could a Gentile convert to Christianity without first becoming a Jew? That's a serious question. The second important question that this comes out is, if a Gentile became Christian but didn't convert to Judaism, how would the Jewish Christians be able to relate to them? Could they share at the same table? Could they eat with them? Could they fellowship with them? How would the logistical reasons of Jews and Gentiles being separate, how did Christianity impact that separate, rigid barrier between the two? Those are the questions we're going to be pondering, and those are I want you to understand those are identity forming questions for these people. This isn't just some easy sort of thing. It is this idea of these are who these people are. These are how these people are defined. So Luke's going to be entering into these next couple chapters, entering in stories that will strike at the heart of Jewish identity and Jewish Christian identity, and in order to talk about including Gentiles among the Christians. Some questions to ponder. Have you ever been unsure if you were considered a part of a group or not? Did that group have rigid or relaxed boundaries? Do you think churches are typically too rigid or too relaxed in defining who is a part of them and who is not? How can clear boundaries be helpful with including others? We'd love to hear your thoughts on those questions. Drop down in the comment section and give me any answers you choose to. As always, there are 3 ways to join this conversation: in person Sunday nights at 5, live Monday nights at 7 via Zoom, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and or WordPress. I'm all over social media: Instagram, TikTok, WordPress, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I would love you to like, follow, and subscribe on any of those. Connect with me, direct message me, or engage me in conversation on any of those social media platforms. I would love to hear from you. Enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully it continues real soon.